It's natural. When you go into a room, you are naturally going to be attracted to those who seem like you. Okay, that's just natural. It's good to be aware of that and say, hey, maybe I'll go and talk to this person who isn't like me. But to accuse a person against their, just because you naturally are attracted to those like you, that doesn't make you evil or prejudiced. It's what you do with your reaction that determines that. Right? Do you treat people who are different than you differently? Do you other them? That's a big problem, because throughout history, when governments have wanted to go to war, the easiest way, do propaganda is to other the enemy, because it works. We're just wired to go for it, right?
But anyway, Dr. Virginia Campbell, thank you so much for your time today. This is I dug into so I do want to go through. I want to use your book as the underpinnings of everything we're talking about, because you sent me the PDF of it, and I figured, I'll just kind of skim through it and pull out some small little summary artifacts, and we'll kind of talk about it that way. But it sent me down a rabbit hole. It really did, because I think it underpins, and you may not, and we'll kind of dive into this, but the main takeaway of your book, and I'll have you introduce it in a second here. I just started thinking of it's almost the underpinnings of everything that's good and bad about sort of our humans and our relationships with each other, and what we think we know, what we don't think we know. And then I started thinking about bias and political bias, and gosh, it's never ending. So I really love the content, because for me, I always try to understand, we're social creatures, and all the crap we go through, the good and the bad. And if you read my little summary I sent you, I probably pulled you into the web of what goes on in my head, which is a little crazy in there. But I think I'm always trying to understand the neuroscience behind it, because you can't take that out of it. Everything we do happens because our brain is telling us to do it, or, anyway, with that, maybe a little background on yourself, and then give us maybe a little summary of your book and what motivated you to write it.
Okay. Well, I'm a physician by training and profession. Started out doing ER medicine for over 20 years, and then changed to palliative medicine about 8 years ago. I started podcasting in 2006 because I heard my first podcast in 2005, okay, in iTunes when it first appeared, and I was like, this is the coolest thing ever. I want to do it, but it took me
You're
a
an OG.
while. What does OG stand for?
Oh, original gangster. Sorry. You're one of the
Yeah.
pioneers, the original
No,
folks.
I mean, I think the 2004 people are the real pioneers. I consider myself only a semi pioneer.
Okay.
But at any rate, I just happened to be reading about the brain at the time that podcasting came along. I started really getting interested in around 2003. I will say that this is not my specialty. I'm not a neurosurgeon. I'm not a neurologist, but that's actually what is the strength of my show, because I come at brain science from the non-specialist point of view.
Yeah.
I do have enough science and engineering background to read the literature and help the scientists, translate what they are talking about into plain English, so to speak. I sometimes think of what I do as very similar to what I do with my patients when I'm explaining a medical thing to them. I've always enjoyed making medicine accessible to people by getting rid of the jargon, and that's kind of the same thing I do on brain science. And what happened was, back in the early days of podcasting before Facebook, discussion forums were still popular, and I was on a forum for a show called the Sci-Fi Zone, which was about the intersection of philosophy and science fiction. And people kept posting stuff about the brain that was just wrong. And I would post, well, if you would just read this book, you would know that it's really this. And so finally the host says to me, well, why don't you just record a book review? And I did that. It was only 10 minutes long. It was on a book by Jeff Hawkins called On Intelligence. And when I recorded it, well, you're a podcaster, I got the adrenaline rush that podcasting gives you. But I also was like, this is it. if I do a show about the brain, I will never run out of material.
Mhm.
And this is 2006, okay? So this before it was as hot as it is now, but still that's kind of how brain science got started. But at the time, I was a big fan of Mur Lafferty, who is one of the original inductees into the Podcast Hall of Fame. And she had 2 podcasts. So I thought, I'll have 2 podcasts too. So I so I started Brain Science. It was called Brain Science Podcast in those days. I've taken podcast out of the name about 10 years ago. Uh, but I started a second show called Books and Ideas, which was going to be the place where I put anything that didn't fit. And so over the years, I've had, sci-fi writers, scientists, philosophers, all kinds of different people on Books and Ideas. But it never really grew because it wasn't really in a niche, whereas brain science had the advantage of being in a niche. And
Mhm.
so I quit producing it 2 or 3 years ago. I can't exactly remember when I quit producing it, but brain science is still going strong. Will be 17th anniversary pretty soon.
Wow.
And my main motivation is that I want people to understand, what the science really says about the brain, because mainstream media coverage of science in general sucks,
Mhm.
and neuroscience also. And so they just keep perpetuating myths like you only use 10% of your brain, which is, not totally wrong. So that was the thing I really wanted people to understand, what the science really says, partly to protect them against quacks, because and this part's gotten worse, all the brain science neuro quackery out there, buy this thing and it's going to make you smarter and blah. I wanted people to have a defense against that kind of quackery. But
Mm.
also, and this is where my book comes in, I think that understanding how our brain really works gives us insight into why we act the way we do, why I act the way I do, why you act the way I do. And hopefully understanding this could give us more tolerance for one another. And that's really the theme of my book, is that once you understand that certainty, the feeling of certainty, is something your brain generates, and it doesn't mean the thing you are sure about is necessarily true, then you could be wrong. I could be wrong. Maybe we should both admit we could be wrong and focus on what we have in common instead of the current, thing of only focusing on where we disagree, which
Mhm.
is, destroying our society right now.
For sure. For sure. Yeah. So it sounds like you agree with, my some I guess where I think a major application to your subject matter in your book could be, and that's us people, our division. I think people, we tend to own our thoughts and our beliefs as if I don't know, as if they're part of they're not just something we have, but they are us. And
Hmm.
it's an odd thing, and I don't remember where I started running to that sort of mantra, but
Well, I think we could blame Descartes.
oh, does it go back that far? Okay,
Well, it probably goes back farther, but
okay,
he was the one who said, I can't be sure of anything else except my thoughts. And I know I exist because I have thoughts. I mean, that was
mm,
Descartes. And
interesting.
he's the father of what we call dualism, which is the idea that your mind is somehow separate, from your brain and your body. And
Mm,
he never you have to cut him a slack, though, because he did live in the 17th century. Maybe it was even the 16th century. So a long time ago, he had some good original ideas, but we got stuck with this thing about them being separate. And one of the things is just the simple fact that our brain, it's telling us what we need to know. We do not need to know how it's generating our experience or how it's generating our thoughts. That's not really helpful. So it's invisible to us. So it feels like you get a great idea. It came out of nowhere, or it came from, whatever source you believe in, but it's all comes to that, down to that. You can't feel where it came from.
mm,
Michael Graziano, one of my favorite guests, says, the brain gives us a stick figure account of the world. I mean, it tells us what we need to know, and it leaves a lot of stuff out. Um, and that's the thing about certainty. It feels, uh, well, once you're certain about something, you don't really necessarily, you can maybe go back and say, oh, this is why I'm right. But that feeling that you're certain, that's generated unconsciously. You don't control that. And that's the other thing. Because you don't control it, this is a key point. Because you don't control it, it also means you don't control what you believe. I mean, people think, oh, I believe this, and that makes it right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You don't even control what you believe. I mean, two people look at the same facts, right?
Yeah.
And they come to different conclusions. This makes no sense unless you look at how the brain generates that feeling of certainty. And then then you go, well, that does make sense. And I want to, before you ask me anything else, I want to take a minute and give credit for these ideas because it's not my original work. It's based on the work of a neurologist named Robert Burton, who wrote two really good books. This particular, my book was really inspired by his first book, which is called On Being Certain, Believing That You're Right, Even When You're Not.
Mm.
And he also wrote a second book called The Skeptic's Guide to the Brain. A Skeptic's Guide to the Mind, which takes the themes further. But so I really have to thank him because he was very gracious about allowing me to use this material in this book. Because, like I said, he did the hard work. The book was really based on several interviews I did with him, but he gave me permission to put it into book form. So I'm very grateful for
Yeah,
that
you
because,
reference his name quite a bit in your book. Yeah, I
right.
noticed.
And,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I just really encourage anybody who says, hey, I'd like to know more about this. I mean, I'd love for you to read my book, but it's a very, beginner level on the thing. If you really want more detail, his books are where you want to go.
No, your book was very much. I say layman's, and I mean that in a complimentary way, where it's very accessible. It's like I just skimmed it. I was like, oh, I kind of get what. Like I really kind of get what you were saying. I didn't have to say what the heck. It wasn't a lot of It was so yeah. It was very accessible. So for those listening, yeah, it's a good easy onboarding into the complexity of the brain. I would say. Um, Now this gets philosophical pretty quickly, but the and if you looked at my notes I sent you, I think, and I think you're 100% right in that if we can, again, I go political because it's like the extreme, especially here in the United States, right? It's like the extreme example of people, all of us, being so certain of our beliefs that the other side has to be wrong, right?
Yeah.
And we take it to just this, violent, almost kind of aggression at times. Maybe not physical, but just even just emotional. And I'm always torn. First of all, it's so silly that one entire half of the country is always wrong and the entire other half is always right, and vice versa. Which is sort of such, when you step back and look at it, you must think, oh, well, then we all must be kind of wrong and kind of right. So can we just stop the BS? But that aside, there is power in, and I always struggle with this. And I think if you look at my notes, right, I always quote, and I've said this a million times on my podcast, I apologize, but it's kind of lonely here in the thinking center where people are like, oh, are you a conservative? Are you a liberal? Are you a this? Are you a that? Are you I'm like, yes. And like, that's not fun or sexy. Right? When you say yes, it's like, well, are you on my side or their side? It's like, well, what does that even, why do I have to pick a side? Right? How about I just, I like some of that. I have problems with some of that. What about we turn this dial and turn that dial? If you can underpin the entire thing with compassion towards our fellow human beings, I think we'd all be better. But there's sort of not, I guess, being certain, being again, which is the underpinning of, I think, your book and this discussions, like being certain, feeling confident, and taking a stance on things. There's power in that.
Mm-hmm.
And what sometimes I find myself, even personally, just questioning and being open-minded to everything and every viewpoint and saying, wow, interesting, never thought of that. Interest. So unless I'm going to seclude myself to a life of philosophy and sit in a corner and just think all day, it is a little bit of a hindrance, I would say, in some ways, right? There are some downsides to being just having no, and maybe I'm not thinking about it the right way, but I find, and maybe there's just a tendency for human beings to like, we want to be certain on some things, we want to have a foundation to stand on and just champion that, and maybe that goes too far. So I don't know if there's a question here more as opposed to maybe more just some more discussion points. Where do you see there's some,
Well,
accepting that we can never be certain, there's some
right. So
downside to
let's
that
talk
maybe?
about, yeah, maybe we should talk about why we all do this. I mean,
Yeah.
we all are wired to feel certain, right?
Mm,
Why is this? Um, it has survival benefit because there are situations where you need to make decisions quickly and you have to be sure about them.
yeah.
So the people who talk about this stuff talk about, I think, what they call category 1 errors versus category 2. So category 1 is when you think there's a tiger and there's not one, but you take action. Category 2 is when you decide there's not a tiger when there is and you get eaten. Well, obviously, it's much better to make the first one.
Right.
Think there's a tiger and take action and not get eaten even though there wasn't a tiger. So you can see why there's a bias in the system toward certainty from a survival point of view. It's
Right.
also just hard not to be certain, like you said. And it is hard to function even on a day-to-day basis. I remember my sister in college, she had this roommate who couldn't decide anything. She couldn't even decide if she was going to go to the movies. She drove my sister bonkers
That's a
because she
frustrating
couldn't.
person. Yeah. Yeah.
Right, right. So, the person who can't decide anything can't function either. So
Yeah.
but as Dr. Burton pointed out, people have different tolerances for uncertainty, right? There are the know-it-alls who just have to go around saying they know everything about everything. They are very, it's like they're addicted to certainty.
Mm,
And then there are the other people who are really comfortable in the I don't know place. Most of us are kind of in the middle, and it depends on the situation. But we see the extremes, and that neither extreme is particularly healthy. Now, um, in terms of the political divides, I think we have to realize that it's not just about certainty. It's also about the fact that we are wired to be tribal. I
yeah.
mean, if you think about it, I mean, probably for most of our history, we needed that also.
To
You know,
survive. Yeah.
people didn't live with strangers. I mean, we actually live in a very unusual situation if you compare our situation to most of the history of humankind, when people would have lived with a small band or tribe of people that they had known their entire life, and to be suspicious of those you don't know would be a natural thing to do. And now we're in a situation where we constantly deal with people we don't know, and we jump to conclusions about what we think their tribal identity is. And part of that is, because that's the way we're wired. So i I think, you know I said this to somebody the other day. It's natural. When you go into a room, you are naturally going to be attracted to those who seem like you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, that's just natural. Now, it's good to be aware of that and say, hey, maybe I'll go and talk to this person who isn't like me. Okay, but to accuse a person against their, just because you naturally are ac- attracted to those like you, that doesn't make you evil or prejudiced. It's what you do with your reaction that determines that.
That is a
Do
really
you
good
do
point.
right?
Really
Do
good
you
point.
treat
Yeah.
people who are different than you differently? Do you do you other them? Okay, and
Yeah.
you mentioned the othering the other day.
Yeah.
I mean, a minute ago,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a big problem, because throughout history, when governments have wanted to go to war, the easiest way to do propaganda is to other the enemy, because it works. We're just wired to go for it, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So we have to be aware, and that's why many successful peace efforts are aimed at making people aware that the people on the other side are people, their mothers, it's their sons that you're killing, just like they're killing our sons. Those people
Huh.
who look at the world that way don't want to do war.
Right.
But the people who get strong onto the othering, you know, they just so, you know, I think the bottom line is that there's two things. One is that we're in a very unusual situation. Living with a lot of diversity is not really our evolutionary heritage. So it's going to be hard. Doesn't mean we can't do it, but we need to recognize that there are challenges, and some of those challenges really do have to do with the brain that we evolve. But being aware of it, you know, because we also know that this whole thing about thinking of people about other is knowing people in any given group. It's been well proven that prejudice goes down when you know a person
Hmm.
in that group as a person.
Sure.
So, you know, the biggest way to have successful diversity is for people to mix together, but they have to make a effort because it doesn't. It's not our natural. It's not our natural thing to do. However, I want to say that this book really, although it's about certainty, it's really about a larger theme, which is that most of what our brain does is unconscious. Okay, it's not just this. This is an example. And in Dr. Burton's second book, he takes this theme further to some other examples of how this works. For example, agency, the sense that you control your body, is another example of something that's unconscious. It happens because you think about moving and there's a certain time relationship between you when you move and when you thought of it, and so
Mm.
it feels like you did it. I mean, it's been shown that you can make people feel like their hand doesn't belong to them just by, you know, making a false, you know, delay so that it seems like it's not working, it's not moving at the
Yeah,
right
yeah, I've seen some
time,
of that. Yeah, it's
right?
interesting. Yeah, yeah.
So that's just another example. So it's not that certainty is somehow special or different. It's just an example
Mm.
of what our brain does, and one that, because it has so much influence on our life, I picked um, as the one to demonstrate the bigger principle, which is that most of what our brain does is unconscious.
Hmm.
And I don't mean the like Freud's unconscious. I mean, you know, wired in a place that you can't get to it. Um,
Yeah. Now, how does that? So, I'm a big fan of mindfulness, and maybe I define it a little bit, maybe not completely by the book, and I could how I think this is what I well, I shouldn't say that. Anyway, the idea that we can actually be thinking about how we're thinking, right? I mean, we
right.
understand how we're feeling because we kind of can separate those two. And sometimes I think about it. If I take what you said, and that most of what we're thinking is not really conscious and sort of happening almost on autopilot, to kind of simplify it, I, I could accept that, I guess, because, well, based on what you said, it makes sense. But I also think I feel like there's like another part. If I'm going to be mindful and say, oh, say I'm going through a rough time or I can feel it, and I want to tell myself, hey, those are just feelings you're having. They're temporary. They're not you. And I can kind of separate and almost kind of spin off another thread of my brain. I'm a computer science guy by trade, so I think of these threads in parallel, whatever. So I'm almost spin up another thread of my brain that's like I'm trying to like use that separate thread to like observe the unconscious thread that's
Mhm.
giving me those bad feelings and say, hey, all right, you know, like almost zoom above yourself and look down back on yourself and say, okay, I see what you're going through. Those emotions, those chemicals you're feeling, they suck right now. But and try to talk to myself from outside that feeling. It almost like, I guess, does that make sense based on what you just said, where most of those thoughts are unconscious? But is there any conscious
Oh,
part of it, or is it all just
oh,
in that
okay. So
unconscious
first
realm?
of all, I think that you might have partly misunderstood what I said. I'm not saying that you're having all these thoughts that are unconscious. That's not what I mean. What I
Okay.
mean is a lot of the stuff your brain does is unconscious. For example, visual processing is largely unconscious. That's the reason why even when you see an optical illusion, even when you know it's an optical illusion, you still see it, right? You can't unsee the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
illusion because you don't control that processing that leads to the thing that you see.
Mm.
So what I mean is when that feeling pops up, you don't really have access. to the processes that led to that feeling. What you experience is the feeling.
Mm.
Okay. So when you're doing mindfulness, and it's not contradictory or against mindfulness at all. When you're doing mindfulness, you know, you when a feeling or a thought comes up, you go, "Oh, that's a thought, that's a feeling. This too shall pass." I mean, that's one of
Yeah,
the
yeah.
powers of mindfulness, especially for people who have anxiety or issues like that, because if you follow the feeling, you can go down a bad deep hole. But if you just go, "Oh, that's gonna get better," it usually comes and goes. You don't know where it came from. You don't really really know where it goes, but you can. It's the hanging on to it that really which kind of gets to that whole Buddhist
Yeah, yeah.
idea, that the source of suffering, is the clinging or pushing away of things. And so really mindfulness is about not doing that. It's about saying, "Oh, I'm feeling this feeling, and I can choose to look at it, or I can choose to just go, oh, well, it'll go away if I give it a chance. I can choose to focus on my breath instead, in
Yeah.
which case, that feeling will usually dissipate on its own." So I don't see mindfulness as a contradiction at all. But the point I would make is there is a limit to what you can accomplish with mindfulness. In other words, you're not going to, with mindfulness, figure out what your brain is really doing.
Mm.
Okay. Because you can't do that because your brain's not telling you what it's doing. And all you know is what it tells you. I mean, that's the other important principle. Everything we experience is a product of our brain. That gives us the world that we experience. Each one of us has a slightly different experience. We have ability to share some experiences, and they're close enough that we uh, you know can agree on certain things, and sometimes we disagree on others. But the idea that the thing we're experiencing is the real reality, that's called naive realism.
Hmm.
And obviously even physicists don't think naive realism makes any sense anymore. So um, the fact that our brain's not giving us all the information, actually, when you think about it, it's a blessing. I mean, think about when you learned how to drive and how hard it was when you had to focus on learning how to drive, right? You can
Right,
do
right.
anything else. So really, the fact that most of what our brain does is unconscious is a good thing. It's not a glitch. It's a feature,
Mm.
because we also know that our spotlight of attention, so to speak, what we can focus on, is very small. So,
By design, right,
but
right. Yeah, yeah.
right,
Mm.
well, I don't know whether design is the right word, but it's like multitasking is a total myth, because that's not how the brain works. It can really only do one thing at a time.
Yeah, it's just switching really
Young
quickly
people
back and forth, right?
switching really quickly.
Which is
So,
not good. Yeah. For
which
productivity, yeah.
right, even young people's productivity is hurt, despite the fact that they think they're really great at it. Um,
Yeah.
and so, given that our ability to focus is relatively limited, it's really a good thing that so much of what our brain does, like if I had to focus on visual processing, if I had to do visual processing
Exhausting.
consciously,
Yes.
well, and I wouldn't be able to do anything else. And I
Right.
picked visual processing for several reasons. One is we understand vision better than anything else. And the other is, believe it or not, there was a time when it was believed that visual processing was conscious, which just goes to show you that scientists are often
Mm.
wrong, and why changing your mind if you're a scientist is a good thing, not a bad thing.
Yeah. Unless you have 200 published papers and you don't want to undermine your
Right,
life's
you
work,
still,
which is
but
what
you
they
still,
do, and they don't want, they
but
want to take
but
their beliefs to the grave, and I'll get into that. That's
well,
another
but
thing.
that's because scientists are human.
Right,
That's
right,
because
right, right, right.
scientists are human.
Yep, yep.
Um,
But totally agree with you,
but
right? I mean, science should be what can I, what, I mean, right? I mean, that's the definition of science, right? What can I find out today that's going to disprove what I thought was true? It's sort of the whole scientific method, right? Like you hold a belief until you start finding evidence against it, and then you flex, and then but
yeah, I don't think it's as simple as that. That's Karl Popper's, um, philosophy of falsifiability, which is
Mm,
a good principle. I think that if something wants to call itself a scientific theory and it doesn't make any predictions and it can't be tested, then it's not science.
mm.
But that's not
It's
all
not
there
complete.
is.
Yeah.
That's not all there is
Mm,
to it. I mean, I'm not a expert on the philosophy of science, but I've read enough to know that Popper is not all there is to it.
mm.
Even between Popper and Kuhn was the guy who believed in the scientific revolutions that basically the old generation had to die out because a new idea would come along and the old generation wouldn't take it, so then they would have to die out, which is kind of like what you said a minute ago. Those two guys were back in the 60s, and I
Mm.
think philosophy of science has come a long way since then, even though
Yeah.
it's not a field
No, I
I
think there's
follow
some truth to
closely.
that. Would you agree? I mean,
Oh yeah,
in
I'm
other
not saying
words,
those
there's
yeah,
always
those
truth in the,
theories
like
are
this. Yeah, there's always like
right.
gradients of truth in everything, right? It's like you got the old population, and I mean, I'd make this joke with my wife all the time, and even we're starting to feel it now. We're in our 40s, and we're like, and we start to get mad at the kids on their tablets and the fact that they're not learning cursive anymore, and it's like I could feel that, old school kind of, hey, I think progress is good in certain ways, and some bad in those. But I could feel us doing what our parents did and our parents did, where they want to hold on to what was, and it's like, well, you got to kind of evolve and maybe learning to write. I told my wife this even this morning because my son's at camp and like writing back and forth. I'm like, oh, okay, he's learning cursive, but the next generation's not going to learn it. I'm like, maybe at some point writing with your hand is not going to be the thing we need to do, and everything is going to be digital, or eventually mind thought. Like, so there isn't, I guess my point is,
Yeah,
there is an
I
evolution of the old has to sort of let go on things, and that gets accelerated when they die off, right? So I guess there's a balance
Yeah,
there
I will.
too.
I do want to say something about the writing part, though. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that learning is enhanced by the more senses that you're using, and so writing something it really does help with learning. I mean, that's why many people find. I don't guess I can't shouldn't say most. Many people find taking notes to be helpful. I mean, I like
I
to take
100%
notes
agree.
even when
I'm
I
that
know
guy. Yep,
I'm
yep.
never going to look at them. However, I
Yes.
don't think there's anything magical about writing cursive. I mean, even if people only learn how to, write the alphabet, the, the
Mm-hmm.
one before cursive, whatever that's called, that'd be fine. I mean,
Yep.
I write handwriting all the time. Um, I'm constantly just flipping back and forth between cursive and not
Oh, I'm
cursive.
the
I mean,
same
I
way.
don't think
Same way.
it's right.
Yeah.
But being able to write, I think, is important to, you know, to learning and being able to
It
remember. So
does
I
enhance
hope
your
that
memory.
we,
Yeah, the tactile feel and all that. I'm 100% with you
right.
on that. In fact, I do the exact. I keep a notebook that I'm writing. It's almost like, okay, this is going to put it in more permanent storage in my brain, and I very rarely go back to the notes. 100% agree. But I
Exactly.
guess if you extrapolate that over another 1,000 years, we'll probably having the same conversation about typing. And some neuroscience will be like, well, it shows that typing,
No,
even though you can think thoughts, and you can get them to communicate because you don't have to type anymore. Typing, we found over the last 1,000 years, has evolved to where when you're typing, it gets into your brain better. I mean, is that possible in a
well, it's
thousand years
not
from
true
now?
right now. Not true now, so I don't know why it would suddenly become true. Typing doesn't
Well, not
have the
suddenly. A
same.
thousand years, that's a long time. I mean, whatever,
Yeah.
10,000, there's got to be some evolution in that, the way the brain adapts, no?
Well, it all comes down to the issue of what's known as embodied cognition, which is that
Hmm.
um, we learn with our bodies, and that is. I mean, there's even people have shown that for teaching kids to read, if they have toys where they manipulate the toys and reproduce the story, that helps them to remember it. So I think
Yeah.
as long as we are in these bodies that we currently have, and we God forbid haven't been uploaded to the cloud, um
It's coming.
I
It's coming.
nah, well, it's a long ways away. I'm not worried about it.
It's coming for sure. Neuralink I know they got a lot to learn with Elon Musk's Neuralink, a lot to learn, but
Well, I'm glad that it's harder than he thinks, because he's the
yes,
last person on earth I would trust to do it. Well, second to a person whose name begins with a T.
Okay, I see where you're going with that. We won't go there, but no, I agree with you. I do think that is one, and I don't know where the timeline is, but when they start getting the brain, of course he's an entrepreneur, right? He's going to say, oh, we're going to do it in 3 years, whatever. Maybe add a couple zeros to that, right? But we'll see. Um, but you said a couple things that, you said when I'm just curious if we can define a couple words, because for me it's all the brain, right? And I think you'd sort of agree, but you said, hey, the brain doesn't tell us everything. The brain's not giving us all the information. Who is the us in that category, in that sentence? Isn't it just another? Is it just another part of the brain? Because there's no brain and then us, or is there? Like,
No, the us is the whole of our body, which includes our brain. So again, back to the embodied cognition.
yeah,
I don't see the mind as being this disembodied thing. I see, and this is my take on it because there's lots of different takes on it. I see the mind as being the interaction of the body, the brain, and the world. Those three
mm.
things. Without any of those, you can't have mind which is why the image of the brain in a bat doesn't work because it's disembodied. Um, for me, it doesn't work. Um,
I like that though. The
so
mind is basically the superposition of body, brain, and world. That makes
Right. So
sense.
it's
Yeah,
not as
yeah,
simple as the analogy that is often used of thinking of, the mind as the software or something like that. That's the thing about it is the brain, our mind, as created by our brain in its interaction with the world, it's not a computer. There are a lot of things that are very different about how our brain works from a computer. Um, the closest thing you could come to if you were a computer scientist, I think, would be to think of it as being a hybrid between an analog and digital computer. And I don't know if you're probably too young to have ever seen an analog computer.
I've
I went
seen
to
them. Yeah,
engineering.
I've seen them in the
Yeah,
out
I
of
went to
college in the
engine.
late '90s, and they
They
had
actually
some
used
rooms.
analog
Yeah,
computers to simulate the moon landings, and I went to college at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, which was right next to the um, NASA
yeah.
where they did, so we literally had all these huge analog computers in the hall that had been
That's a
given
great
to
spot
us.
for a geek. Yeah, I love that. Yeah,
Right, and
yeah.
I did a class where we actually programmed small analog computers
Hmm.
because it was the very end of the analog computer time. But because everyone knows that there's electrical signaling in the brain, but there's an awful lot of biochemistry going on,
Yeah.
an awful lot of biochemistry. So it is not, I mean, even the synapse, the connection between the two, it's very, very complex, much more than even most neuroscientists are still realizing. I've had the honor to talk to a scientist named Seth Grant, who's done some of the leading edge research on this. They now know there's thousands of proteins in the synapse, and
Mm.
some of those proteins act like little computers just in and of
Oh my,
themselves,
yeah. Oh.
which leads to whole different theories about how memory works. And that's the reason why I'm not worried about this whole, uploading to the cloud thing, because I think our understanding of what's going on is still very, 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 very primitive. And secondly, our brain, not being a computer, is constantly changing. And even if you could get, the connectome and have a wiring diagram for a human brain, it would be a snapshot that would be already obsolete by the time you uploaded
Right.
it.
It's
So,
consistently changing. Yeah, yeah.
regular computers, man-made computers are pretty static from that standpoint. You can change the contents of memory, but the wiring diagram doesn't change. And so we are so far away. That's the
Yeah,
way I look at
yeah,
it.
no, I think in that sense you're exactly right. To truly replicate that wiring diagram, I think the danger comes in where we start, right? And companies like Replica and others, you can look them up, are already doing this exact thing where with, for example, neural networks and machine learning, that's just quote unquote wiring and software, and that's always changing. And that's how they just that's how ChatGPT's work, and it's just language models that take a lot of data in and start learning, and they don't change the wiring, right? The software is the software. You just give it more data, and then it just starts changing how it understands things. The thing that scares me about getting to this AI world and quote unquote consciousness, it's not that it'll actually be your conscious, is that, and if you look up the company Replica, they're kind of doing this, and some of the things are kind of scary. And there's a company in North Korea South Korea, that's doing it now, where they're God forbid you have and I talked about on a few of my past podcasts, but where they're it's a little bit of a tangent, but where they're say you have a child and they're 12 years old and they die, for example, but the child's been on social media since they were 5 or 6 or whatever it is. So the algorithms will go and query and just aggregate all that data. Now they have a pretty good idea of that child's personality, how they they have a lot of messages and recordings, so they knows its voice, it knows all the articulations, it knows what they like, what they don't like, and then it takes that and it creates a person, quote unquote, out of it. And that's like a digital representation of that person. Now, is it their consciousness? No, to your point, it's exact, not at all. But then they start extrapolating that, and that you can buy this package now, and little Jimmy grows up with you and then gets married, and mom and dad can log in. And that's what scares me about this whole sort of going back to it's not quite the Neuralink thing, but it's almost like a simulated consciousness, where that's quite, that can be a little disturbing. But anyway, that's a little bit of an
Yeah,
aside.
to me, the more disturbing one is technologies that are based on disproven science. So, for example, they're using technologies that allegedly can tell your emotions from your facial expressions. Okay. And they use these in security things. They're supposed to figure out that you're suspicious or
Yeah,
whatever
yeah.
from your facial expression, but it's based on outdated science, because it's based on science done in the 60s by this scientist named Paul Ekman, who supposedly proved that across cultures, facial expressions could be recognized and they were universal, and they universally represented some basic emotions. Okay. And a lot of people think this is true because it's one of those ideas that has been disproven, but nobody knows it.
Yeah.
So the problem with the way that he did his original work was he gave the people lists of emotions to pick. Okay. If you replicate this study and you just ask them what the person is feeling without giving them words
Without
to
their
choose
prompt,
from,
yeah.
the correlation goes away completely. And there's a wonderful book called How Emotions Are Made by Lisa Feldman Barrett, she's the sort of leading opponent to this idea that emotions are basic things that are unchanging across cultures. She says they're learned, and her evidence, I think, is very strong. But she has a picture in her book that I think is perfect. It's a picture of Serena Williams, okay? And if you've ever seen Serena Williams, you can just imagine a picture of Serena
Yeah.
Williams, okay? Okay. So, the point is, if you looked at this picture without any context, what would be the emotion you would think she was expressing? Well, it
Pain or
depends.
anger.
You might say it's pain or anger, but
Right.
it actually is that she just won this big point and she's going,
Completely
yeah.
joyful. Right.
So, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's the reality, is that there's context to facial expressions. And so if I'm going to get picked up by some computer that says, like, I might be somebody suspicious because I had like a mean look on my face or something, or even, these programs are also racially biased, that's another problem. But so this is again, getting back to why I do my show, this is the reason I do my show. I think people need to know the real science, and real science changes. So, I mean, I had an episode about Paul Ekman's work, back in 2007. But I've since then, posted that the reason why Paul Ekman's work does not mean what people thought it meant. So that's what you got to do if you're doing science. Science
Yeah.
changes and adjusts to, um, you know, I mean, the ancient Greeks did actually know the Earth was round, but when Copernicus came up with the idea that the Earth was going around the sun, he didn't have the ability to actually prove that yet.
Mm.
It wasn't until Galileo came along and had a telescope. So that's the way it works. The technology changes what we can measure. It has its downside because we tend to measure what we can measure, like it's
Yeah, yeah,
if
yeah.
all you got's a hammer, everything's a nail. So,
Right.
there's also bias to science that's related to what we ask, what we can ask. So, but it's the best method that we've got.
Agreed. Yeah. But you said it
It's
earlier.
the only
Yeah.
it's the only self-correcting method that we've got.
Right.
I mean, the alternative is to say, "Oh, somebody 2,000 years ago had all the answers." Why that should be true is beyond me.
Hmm. Yeah. Now, do you find yourself practicing sort of this idea, from you in personally? Because I think what I sent you, I try to. In other words, like, am I really certain of this? I kind of ask myself that often, and then how do I know I know this, or how
Mhm.
do I know I don't know this? And I'm always kind of in this wishy washy middle. And I think generally it's helped me be a better person, because you do really see. I've met people, and out of the gate, I'm like, ugh. Ugh, and I just get that feeling, right? And I agree with you. You said something earlier that I think was really on point, which is that we are hardwired for that feeling, right? That you're not like me for whatever reason. You don't look like me. You don't sound like me. You don't believe what I believe. That first reaction, I think we need to give each other a little grace, and that initial feeling you get is not necessarily bad but it's how you react to it and what you do with that feeling. And I think you said that, and I think that's important, because what I've seen is people, so especially, like, again, you look at the mainstream now, it's like, if people make any sort of profiling or decisions based on how someone's behaving or looking, it's a slippery kind of thing, because some people do look more suspicious than others. Now, right? And that's just and it's that crosses races, it crosses everything. So I don't think we should poo-poo that. I think we right. I mean, I've always said this, after 9/11, when someone comes through that is of a certain right, it's going to raise suspicion if they're a Middle Eastern looking person. Why is that bad? That person should not be treated differently, right? If they're vetted properly and nothing, but that initial gut, isn't that okay? Isn't
Mhm.
that just human I mean, that is our survival. It's just when it gets taken to this weird bigotry bias based on nothing is
Right.
but I feel like we don't do a good job of at least acknowledging that we are different. Eventually, I think we have a globe, it's spinning, we all speak the same language, or there's no language barriers, there's no geographical barriers, because we can travel really fast. I think that is happening. I think slowly with air travel, like we start to, right, the tribes are less divisive. I mean, we still suck as people. We're kind of always like drawing lines, but I guess we don't give each other enough grace to at least, and I sometimes will say this to make a point to people, because I like having these deep discussions, folks like you and others. But this is a lot easier because we have context. We can work through
Mhm.
ideas over an hour, and we can understand. Oh, Vinny's not being hateful. He's just trying to understand the brain. But I guess my point is, you made a really good point. I wrote it down, and it's like that initial feeling you get does not mean you're an inherently bad person. It just means, okay, what you do with that makes you an open-minded, smart, growth-minded person. If you say, okay, I felt that person, I'm a Christian, they're an atheist, they're Buddhist, I'm a this, whatever, or they're purple and I'm white. Like, that feeling is okay initially, and then you have to quantify it, understand it, and do the right thing with it, I guess. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I would like to take this in the direction of, what is the role of intuition? Because
Interesting.
you've just
Yeah.
described something that's a gut feeling, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
you know, if I'm walking down a dark street and I have a bad feeling, I don't need to sit there and analyze it. I need to, you know, be somewhere
Listen
else,
to it, right.
right? But if I'm in a safe place and I meet a person who rubs me the wrong way, I don't need to overreact. And I actually had a wonderful guest on my show several years ago, actually a couple who study the neuroscience of magic, because
Oh, interesting.
magicians are masters of using our misleading us because our brain takes shortcuts. It jumps to
Yeah.
conclusions. It does this because, again, if you were in a dangerous situation, time could be the difference between getting eaten or not. But most of the time now, we are not in a situation where we have to make a snap decision. Yet, in recent years, there's been several books talking about how wonderful intuition is and how it's like the superpower and et cetera, et cetera. I would get back to the fact that those gut feelings or intuitions, they're also unconsciously generated just like the feeling of certainty.
Mm.
They aren't necessarily right. This is the point. Your gut feeling, you need to listen to it depending on the situation. But if you got time, you also need to stop and think, well, is this reality or was that just my perception caused by, like you said, you're hardwiring, that person's different from me or whatever.
Yeah.
The problem comes when, two things. Some people have this magical idea that whatever their gut feeling is automatically right. Just like if you're certain, you're automatically
Yeah, you always
right.
hear, "Follow your
Those are
gut, follow
very
your gut, follow your gut."
follow your gut.
Should be an
So,
asterisk there, right? Follow your gut,
but
but
I,
asterisk.
I do want to say something practical about this. Let's say that you're facing a hard decision about, say a job change. That's a typical example. And you try to be logical and you write down your pros and cons and blah, 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 a la Benjamin Franklin, but you still can't make up your mind. Then, there's the old sleep on it idea, right? So you sleep on it, and the next day you're like, I know that what I need to do is
Mhm.
take this new job. That's an example of certainty, right? That's fine because, realizing the limitations, you figure that what's happening, at least the way I look at it based on what I know, is that at night while I'm asleep, my brain is chewing away on everything I know about this topic. It's chewing away on my emotional background, it's chewing away on everything, coming up with this final solution. Now, I still want, I, but that final solution is still not magical, right? I could still change my mind,
Mhm.
right? So many of us make decisions this way, and it works pretty well for most people to do this if we're patient. That's why sleeping on it is such a popular um, option. Sleeping on it only works though if you are willing to, really consider both sides, right? And to really do your homework
Right, put
about,
the work in, yeah, yeah.
yeah, you put the work
Mm.
in to learn as much as you can about the decision, then do your sleep on it part. Um, Even the handwriting of the pros and cons is helpful to the brain processing of that
Sure,
information.
yeah.
So um, the gut reaction, do it without actually examining it. That's great when you're in that situation of immediate danger, which fortunately most of us aren't most of the
Sure,
time.
yeah, yeah.
Even though that might be increasing in some circumstances now, that's still not the average situation for most of us. So, what I want people to remember this because you can use your intuition as a part of your decision process, but don't take it as somehow special or necessarily better than the other information. Okay. I mean, if your intuition says to do something is absolutely wrong, right? Because you have other information,
Right.
then, that's just common sense. So, getting back to the fact that most of what our brain does is unconscious, then we have to recognize that we won't always have a total understanding of where we came up with our decisions.
Mm.
And that's okay, right? Like I said, we don't choose what we believe. We all look at some set of information, and some of us believe one thing and some of us believe another. We can't unbelieve what we believe or believe things we don't believe just because we would like to fit in.
Do you believe we can
That's
change our
where,
beliefs, though, over time? If you
well,
work at
I
something,
think,
is
well, I don't, in my personal experience, I've never found that I could make myself believe something that I had quit believing. And I have tried. So I can't speak for anybody else. I can only speak for my own personal experience. But I also realized that at some point in my life, I might believe different from what I do now. And that's the key, is don't see your beliefs as like set in concrete forever. It's like what you were talking about at the beginning when you said you were trying to be open-minded. I mean, you have core beliefs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that, and almost everyone does. When people are teenagers, they're sort of trying to sort out which of the core beliefs their parents gave them they want to keep and which ones they want to get rid of.
Yeah.
So that's a really hard
Yeah. Where do you trim
time.
that family tree? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And some people just get stuck in a place and they never, they're in a rut and they never change. That's not healthy either. But all of it comes down to, our brain has a certain amount of plasticity. We can change, but it gets harder.
Yeah.
Trying to be open, trying to be open to new ideas. Even now, I want to recommend a really short, old book on liberty by John Stuart Mills. It actually came out the same year as On Origin of Species.
Oh, wow.
And it's very short. It's probably about the same length as my book. And in it, he says some really key ideas about liberty. He talks about the importance of actually listening to other people's that you disagree with, so that you can form your reasons for why you disagree with them. But he also talks about liberty should be only up to the point that you aren't impinging on the other person, which I think is a really common, because he's one of the fathers of utilitarianism. So it's not surprising that he would have come up with this. But liberty can't be unlimited, right? At the point in which I'm impinging on your liberty, then there needs to be a limit on my liberty, and that's not a bad thing. But we recently have been in a certain subset of our population thinks we should have unlimited liberty. I don't think that that's what the founding fathers had in mind, because they would, yeah. Anyway, but On Liberty by John Stuart Mills, it's a really easy read. You can get it from Amazon, and I just think it's a really good book on this topic.
Very cool. I mean, I could go on and on and on. There's so many questions I still have. One thing I want to touch on real quick. So we'll wrap this up in a second. But before we do wrap it up, I heard in a podcast you went on a few, like back in the day in the '90s, you went on some vision quests. Is that true?
Oh yeah,
How was
yeah. I
that?
call them. Well, it
Was
was
this like ayahuasca, or was it just going away and
no.
fasting, or?
Well, it did involve fasting, but there was water because it was in the desert. Yeah, I actually have been on 3 vision quests as a quester and 1 as just a helper. The first time was probably the most powerful because it was probably the first time in my life I'd ever literally been alone, because my mother was a helicopter parent before there were helicopter
Oh
parents.
wow, she was another pioneer.
But
Yeah.
Yeah, it was they were very powerful experiences, and I would tell you that the last one in particular was when I learned the thing I said earlier about the fact that you can't force yourself to believe something just because you want to. I mean, you can lie to yourself, but if you're being honest with yourself, you can't force yourself to believe something just because it would be convenient to you, or socially advantageous, or whatever. But yeah, I actually wrote a book about my first 2 vision quests, but it was never published.
Oh, okay.
For some reason, they were like, "Oh, no one's going to want to read about this because they wouldn't want to do it." And I said, "That's the whole point. People like to read books about things they don't want to do so that they can experience them without doing
Yeah,
them."
we all
But
read books on
anyway,
climbing Everest. How many of us do it?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
But
yeah. Very cool. Very cool.
I want to say one thing about the woman that I went on most of my vision quest with, because she died in 2000 in an accident. Her name was Sidonia Cahill, but she taught me 2 very important lessons. One was, she said, well, first of all, she told me, I'm not the person with the answers, so that's important. But she said, you have to always show up. I mean, the idea that you must show up to your life.
Yeah.
And the second thing was whatever story you tell yourself about your life is the one you're going to live. So it's like if you say, I don't have time to do blah, blah, then you won't have time to do it. So
Yeah. Love
her,
it. I love it. Yeah.
her idea was you want to make, and this was a woman who went to Asia with her 2 teenagers, like in the 70s. But she was an incredible person. But she said, make your story big, make it big and live into a big story. Don't have because if you tell yourself a little story, it's going to be
Little life.
little.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is a great lesson. That is fantastic. Yeah. And I think that's held up. I would say that's some of our best quote unquote influences and, folks that we respect, most respect would absolutely echo that. I mean, that's a theme that I've heard through a lot of the folks that I follow and respect. So that is great advice. Well, Ginger, appreciate it. Where can folks find you?
On social media, I'm usually Doc Artemis, DOCARTEMIS. My website, brainsciencepodcast.com, is where you can get my podcast. If you want to get I have a newsletter that comes out once a month when I have a new episode. If you'd like to get that, you can text Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. If you do that, I'll give you a free handout called 5 Things You Need to Know About Your Brain. So that's Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. There's also a link at brainsciencepodcast.com. You can listen to Brain Science wherever you listen to audio. You can even listen on YouTube, even though it's an audio podcast.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, very cool. I appreciate your time. And thank you for starting a little early here. I appreciate it.